This episode emphasises how aligning with the energy pattern of humanity gives us a roadmap to healing, integration and growth. It also explores the consequences of disconnecting or resisting that energy pattern.
So expanding on what we talked about before, understanding the energy pattern of humanity starts to give us a clearer path of just how we develop as human beings within humanity, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And I think some of the important things about developing human beings is that, you know, and we touched on it in the last one, where we each needed to know who we are to come together as a collective.
Yes.
So one of the critical things that needs to happen is, as young children to adolescents, that's where the focus needs to be, so that they know who they are, what is them, what is not them.
Yes.
And it's really, it is very much from the inside out.
Yeah.
And yeah, sorry, Don.
Yeah, no, that's a key point, because like Storm was talking about, we know ourselves by the outside world.
Yeah.
But I suppose a key part of that developing is knowing ourselves from the inside out.
Yeah.
From the early stages on. How I see this is, if we are able to nurture young people into knowing who they are, then when they enter the world, regardless whether it's work or other relationships or universities and other collectives, right, around, they naturally find a place within that community where their strengths and ideas can come out, and they're more confident in doing that, rather than, as we see now, as I see now, and I'm only speaking for myself, is that when we go into a new workplace or a new community, we see and look for the place that we should be. What is our role in this to best serve my needs of being accepted or liked or whatever? But rather than, so if we flip that to, if we knew and had self-esteem of my true nature, this is my process, I know my place in the world, I know my place within myself, within my family, my school already. So when I enter these new collective spaces, I have a sense of anchor and grounding, and I can naturally find a place that aligns with me.
Yeah.
When we know our own nature in place, other people know our place in nature, and that sets, for me, I guess, a scene or an environment of real inclusion and acceptance, where one can then share knowledge and all of that to the others.
As I listen to you, I got a real sense of, by understanding who I am, my nature, it's a case of, this is what I can bring and add to, rather than I can turn up and fit in.
Yeah, because, absolutely.
And that plays back to our two different patterns. You know, when I'm bringing stuff, I'm connecting, and then I'm integrating, the team is integrating, we're expanding. If I'm fitting in, then I am trying to put part of me into that situation and probably leaving a part of me out.
Yeah.
But also, picking up on something you said, you said when we know ourselves internally and stuff, and we show up, we can see where we fit. Whereas if we don't, then we can show up and other people will tell us where our place is.
Absolutely.
And I'm just, you know, and I probably see that more than the other, where, you know, someone new joins a group, be it a singing group or, you know, a work group or whatever, and people are quick to judge. And then the exclusion happens because, maybe they're not just, you know, the right fit. You know, and when I suppose employers talk about, they're not a good cultural fit. Well, this energy pattern of humanity allows for everyone to fit.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's what is really jarring to me, just listening to you in that short bit, was, wow, we've got it the wrong way around or something.
Yeah.
And so, you know, developing human beings is such a critical part of allowing the nature of humanity to come through and show itself.
Yeah.
And yet, you know, every second person I see will come in, and it doesn't matter if they're 10 or 50, they go, I don't know who I am.
Yeah.
And
I certainly had that when I was about 41, 42, sitting in a small house, confused by the events that had occurred around me, and I had to sit there and say, I honestly have no idea who I am and how I function in the world, because how did I get myself into such a mess?
Yeah, and yet you had a really good education, and, you know,
Top level.
Yeah, whereas like Storm and I didn't have that path, but, you know, you went to a good school, got good grades, went to university, did all those things, and everything, and then and you had good jobs, and it still didn't work out for you.
No.
And do you think it was because of that external defining of who you are?
Totally.
Okay.
I knew myself through grades. I knew myself through winning rugby matches at school. I knew myself through who I was in the rugby club at university. I knew myself as a psychology student. I knew myself as somebody who travelled around the world. I knew myself as a management consultant and so on and so forth. I knew myself by these labels and these jobs.
And so you knew yourself by your doings.
Yes.
Whereas I feel I always knew myself by my being. So I often, and on reflection, listening to your story, I often at times didn't apply myself, even though I knew I could, or I knew, because I was like, I don't need to do that.
Yeah.
And I just knew. And it probably didn't help me, because then people didn't see the potential, right, that I knew, and I didn't apply myself.
Being and doing
grit and all of that totally. So I think for me, I was way skewed on the other side of just in my being this whole time in most of my childhood. Whereas in adult life now, it's I'm producing, I'm doing the being and being the doing, but I'm seeing the results more, and I'm having that.
Yes.
So
yeah. So you really came into wisdom knowing your being, but not how to connect that to your doing.
Yeah.
And you came in the other way. You knew how to do things, but it was not connected.
Yeah.
Wow.
And it wasn't. Which
wasn't,
meant that the doing ended up producing a whole lot of mess. Because it wasn't connected to stuff.
Yeah.
And all the being held me back from doing any doing.
Yeah.
And so whilst part of me knew what I had to do, I also had to work through the false beliefs that held me back and safe in the being and not the doing. So, you know, there's a whole lot of unlearning to happen before the integration and the doing and the being.
And so that's that disconnect.
All connected.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And, you know, I'm listening, and, you know, we're focused on the individual, and yet we're talking about the energy pattern of humanity.
Yeah, I was going to.
So, you know, I'm thinking we actually need to nurture the humanity of people in a caring environment.
Yes.
To nurture people to their, I don't want to say full potential. It's their to their full potential according to their energy pattern, which is part of the energy pattern of humanity. And it's quite a different...
one sits inside of another. And it's almost like the developing needs to not just be solely individual focused, because I think that's like endemic, epidemic, whatever, to where we are now. Right?
And
it has to be... sure, you need to understand your nature, you need to understand your energy pattern, you need to understand how that works in the world, so you understand how you work in the world, but also you individual, me, Bryn, but I also need to know how me a human, irrespective of the label of Bryn, works too. And so there's layers to it for me.
Absolutely.
Because we go back to school, right? It was Bryn who got the grades, right? Bryn who had to individually perform to then go and work in a team.
Yes.
In a sports team.
Yeah, and you know, we haven't really covered it, but part of the energy pattern of humanity is that humanity is a collective.
Yeah.
It's not an individual. It's not everyone. There's groups, and you know, I like to think of it as a collection of people that come together, and it could be anywhere from about, I don't know, 10 to 50 or 60.
And that's why we have Dunbar numbers and things like that.
Yeah, and you know, and it's interesting, you know, what was your collective that you grew up in? Because we all grow up with a collective. Yeah. We have our family, and then the collective, the neighbourhood or whatever. And so I'm interested to understand how you came in with your being and you came in with the doing to the different collectives that you grew up on, because it's in the collective that we live, love and learn.
Yeah.
So,
you know, it's really interesting. As we are talking, what's jumping out for me is, and this happens all the time, perspective, right?
Yep.
Because we're talking about an individual, and when you say Bryn, that Bryn got the grades, Bryn did this. I heard somewhere maybe a couple of years ago that in Eastern culture, because I went to a piano recital, and I heard the saying of, if the student, so the pianist, the student, it's not them, it's the teacher who makes the student. So rather than kind of like, it's not the talent of the student, it's actually the talent of the teacher.
wow.
And so it's just a complete different perspective, right? And well, not complete, but the opposite perspective. We often think, you know, that child is gifted in this, and often they are, sometimes they are. For me, I'm like, there's truth and non-truth in both. But it's the perspective of how we look at something.
I suppose, so what was your perspective? Who was your teacher and who was your teacher in those early formative years that allowed like you to develop your being and you to develop your doing, but not put the other half together? Because I've had a different experience again. And so it's just interesting, but it's always in a collective that this occurs. And you know, you talked about the rugby team, that's a collective.
Yeah.
You talked about psychology student, that's a collective, right? And schooling, that's a collective. So, you know, I'm just trying to discern what those two halves are to sort of understand how could we nurture children to become responsible adults that know both.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So for me, the first thing that jumped out when you asked the question was exposure was my teacher.
Yep.
And exposure to many different ways of thinking and cultures and living as well.
Okay.
So I grew up quite multicultural, and in my family we have lots of different colours, black, white, Asian, all of that growing up, very normal. We also had in our close family unit different religions. So we have some family who are Jehovah's Witness, some who are Muslim, Catholic, and non-anything, and also Aboriginal culture. So I grew, and Greek community as well, up in Darwin, there's some of that as well. So for me, reflecting on my childhood and how I experienced the world, one, I was exposed to all of these different concepts of life, ways of living, and rights and wrongs or worldviews, right? there was one story when my mum went over to Indonesia with my nene, and my nene brought back gifts for all the boys, but not the girls. And I'm one of 3 girls who grew up in my family. And we questioned, how come all the boys got gifts from nene but we didn't? And mum simply said, well, that's just because that's in their culture, but I brought you gifts. So it was nothing right and wrong. It just was. And so from quite early on, I feel my parents didn't give too much energy into right and wrong in life.
Yeah,
it just
so
was.
That's an acceptance.
Yeah. And so the point of where I lean to more being rather than connecting it with the doing is my interpretation and perspective and learnings from that is everything is just everything. So then what's the point? Right?
Yeah.
Too much. And maybe it was too much exposure for my age.
Yeah.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
Too much. As we know now, children need appropriate learning or appropriate concept age, stage by stage. I think I was exposed to too much, or I love the exposure. It gave me what it gave me, but perhaps I didn't have the guidance or the structure or the framework that I needed.
And can I ask, was there a disconnect between your family life with all these different cultures, religions, ways of being, and then when you went and sat in a classroom at school?
I sat in many classrooms. Which one?
Yeah, it's just...
Yeah.
So did you bring all those, I suppose, perspectives and ways of being and that into the classroom, or did you leave them all at the door and be something different?
I don't think I was something different. I feel like I brought the perspectives with me.
Okay.
But then I just didn't apply because it was like, I don't know how to apply in a singular way to what you are asking me in the classroom when I have all of these perspectives that I can come from. I didn't know how to apply it in the classroom. I could answer questions and I knew exactly what the teacher was talking about, but I didn't know how to deliver it in a way that I thought was an appropriate way.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, it did. And do you have a reflection on how it was for you? Because...
In terms of...
Well, the separation between your being and doing.
Yeah. Obviously 11 years of boarding school was very regimented. And there was...
And was that all boys school?
Predominantly.
Yeah, so can I just, in contrast, this was multicultural, multi-religious, multi-ways of being.
Oh yeah, this was diametrically opposite.
And it sounds like yours was very monocultural.
Monocultured.
And there's one way and that's the only way?
Yeah, and there were rules, and there was obvious rules, then there was more subtle rules, and the more subtle rules were the ones that you really, really had to adhere to. And they were never spoken. You just knew when you transgressed them because there was consequence. And yeah, and it was, you just had this sense that this administration, I mean, the secondary school I went to was 125 years old when I was there, so you were part of a thing that had momentum, right? And we've been producing, we've been making boys for this long, and this is what will continue. But then against that, we were really fortunate that my father and his father bought a piece of land in the south of Spain, and it was right at the time of budget airlines. So in Easter holidays and summer holidays, we would go to Spain for 10 days, 2 weeks in Easter and 3 or 4 in the summer. And you got to remember, like, large chunks of my life is just same. And there's, you know, trips home, and that's trips home. Then I'd go to Spain, like, and I'd go to the same place, and you'd start to meet people and, you know, form relationships from year to year and stuff like that. And, you know, you'd have people from Germany, you'd have people from Scandinavia, you'd have people from France, and like, Europe is so very different to England anyway, and like a English boarding school is like the distillation of all of that. So then all of a sudden you've got people, and they're just they kind of let go to who they were, and let go to where they're from, and let go to currents that flowed through what it was to be a human.
Ah, okay.
Right?
So,
And it all of that talks to a part of me that was never nourished, never nurtured, never acknowledged, never normalised, never anything in this other world, but just intuitively made sense to me, and that I could connect to. So I got a sense of it, but it was this place I went to, you know, and couched in holiday as well.
yeah.
Right? So it was this magical place that I'd go to periodically during the course of a year.
Yeah.
Right. And when I left at the end of summer, it was always sadness, because it would be all the way till Easter the next year till I get to go again. It's like, oh. But yeah, so there was a connection, but it was so small, and it was something that I had to keep for myself.
Yes.
So our lives are like this,
I know.
because I feel like mine was the opposite. I had the connection every other time, and in the classroom,
That's what I
would
was asking.
disconnect.
Yeah.
And that's a square classroom. Remembering I did School of the Year as well, so that's
Yes.
completely different.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know, it's quite, there's so many differences. But, you know, so in order to actually nurture human beings to become responsible adults that can be carers of everything, which is what our nature actually is, you know, it seems to me that we need lots of diversity in the classrooms. We need teachers that can have diversity of answers and ways of being, and not making it narrow. We also need it to be a collective. And you said something earlier about, you know, bring the individual, but then you have to work as a collective.
Yeah. Oh,
And the same thing happens when we go to work. We get hired as an individual
to work in a collective.
What if your energy patterns don't align?
Yeah.
You know, and then, you know, the whole learning experience at school or in your family or in any of these collectives has to be collaborative, because it's a collaboration between you, your friends and your teachers.
Which is another key aspect.
And the content and the environment. So,
And, you know, and then it actually has to be a little bit circular, right? So, but for any of that to happen, people need the safety and that care and love that holds the space. And I'm sitting here listening to the both of you, and it actually makes me sad, because that's not what we do for our people today. You know?
As I just told my story and I listened to you, I was overwhelmed with a sense of sadness.
Yeah.
So can I share a story that just happened recently to my 8-year-old son?
Yes.
So a few weeks back, or maybe months back, they had book week at school where they dress up and all of that. And I remember it was my week, and I had prepped my son and asked him, have you thought about, you know, which book and which character do you want to? And he didn't want to dress up, and he didn't want to participate. And so I said, that's fine. And so at the morning of, I checked again. Are you sure you don't want to? You'll be the only one that doesn't. Yep, I'm okay with that. I'd forgotten about that for yonks, right? On the weekend, when their father and I were talking, he showed me out of our son's bag a poster that was laminated and obviously had been put up in the classroom with a photo of our son in his normal school uniform on the day of book parade with a hat or something or other and a book that the teacher had given him, right? Just so that he can participate. However, the writing underneath was something to the effect of, I forgot book week, right? So she had written, the teacher had written, I'd forgotten book week, but my teacher kind of saved it and gave me a book and a costume and the photo. And I was all happy. And their father and I spoke about this, and I was like, actually, he was empowered enough not to. And if he didn't, obviously what we found out later, because I spoke to our son, he said he didn't want to dress up, but when he got there, he did.
Yes.
So it was a bit of both, right?
Yeah.
But in reflection, from my point of view, first understanding that he got caught in a situation where he did and he didn't at the same time is the first step to hearing and empowering him to how he's going to navigate this going forward. Do you want to continue with no costume, or are you happy with the costume, right?
Yeah.
Rather than a narrative of I forgot. One, he didn't forget, he chose. Also, even if he did forget, that's not on the child, that's on the parent, right? He's young, don't put that on him.
Yeah, and that comes back to the responsibility of humanity to care and nurture for children. And when we put responsibilities on children that isn't their responsibility, they're burdened by it.
Yep.
And that's actually a destructive pattern.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's also interesting that when he got there and saw everyone else dressed up, and that's the power of the collective.
Yep. Yep.
And because humans live, love and learn in collectives, the power of that is massive.
Yeah.
The surrounding space. Surrounding,
and,
yes.
And I acknowledge that, you know, him having part in that is the collective nurturing him. However, my nurturing, and nurturing has many facets of it as well.
Yes.
You know, nurturing can be, well, okay, let's acknowledge that now you've changed your mind and you're in this position, where to next?
Yeah.
But rather than putting a complete different narrative, he didn't forget.
No.
At all.
And because by saying he forgot, there's a little bit of shame with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I saw that in him.
Yeah.
And, you know, we had the conversation and he said, yeah, I did, and then I didn't. And he didn't want to say that he remembered and he made a choice not to, because his teacher already assumed that he forgot, which means she assumed that he wanted to.
Yeah.
So, you know, to tell your teacher you didn't want to, that's expectations and, you know, pressure.
And, you know, when we actually set up, you know, our natural way of living, loving, learning, which I keep going on about, is a collective circular collaboration. It's not a power thing. And, you know, when I reflect back on my most, I suppose, I don't even know, my most growth, my most living experiences, it has been in a collective that's very, very collaborative.
Yeah.
And because when it's not, you just feel like shutting down.
Yeah.
And I wonder, you know, how many kids at school just shut down, like, you know, you didn't know which answer to give that would be accepted. So you don't answer anything, so you learn to not do anything.
Yeah.
Right? And I remember my son, he actually disliked colouring in. And one teacher he had wanted them to colour in all the time. And in that year, you know, he never completed a piece of work, because when you completed a piece of work, you had to colour in. And he didn't want to do that, so he just didn't do the work. And so then I get a report saying he doesn't engage, he doesn't work, he doesn't do this. But it comes back to your point about actually understanding why people are doing what they're doing. And if, you know, as we know, because we do this every week, set up a collective circular collaboration for our workshops and that, people feel okay to say, oh, that's not going to work for me. I need to do it this way. And imagine if we could do that from a very young age, how empowered people would be.
I think listening to both of you, like you talked about the most growth experience, and listening to you talk about how your son was navigating a situation. If we're going to consider education or development of human beings, one of the things, because this is one of the things that we unearthed when we realised how the energy pattern of humanity works, and one of the things that we realised was the stuff that should be inside is outside, and the stuff that is outside should be inside, right? To turn this into a tangible example, most of education is focused on external facts and figures. You know, everyone's seen the meme, I'm really glad I can do integrated algebra to work out the area under a curve, because it's really going to help me when I'm 30, 40 years old, right? By and large, it doesn't, right? The key areas of development of a human being are what's going on the inside. And it's in the moment-to-the-moment experience of how you navigate that, right? Because that's the bit, you know, and we can focus on children if you want, but it's the thing that most adults are struggling with. And and we have to recognise where we are at this point in time, that this is stuff that wasn't focused on how to be in a collective, how to navigate the moment-to-moment experience, how to navigate your emotional landscape. All of this sort of stuff.
Also, how to be
yourself.
Collaborative.
And how to be a human, how to know your nature of yourself, how to be, how to do, all of this. And it's at this level that we're in effect talking, and yet that's inside, in us, everything that's going on, everything that people are struggling with, everything that brings people to the front door of wisdom in your life, and they want to sit in our workshops, because our workshops are all about the experience of life that you're having right now and put more ease and grace into that, rather than education and development, not just as a child, but then in the growing arcs of being human afterwards, you know, whether that's professionally and what have you, being totally focused on these external, technical, conceptual stuff, which, is useful to do various tasks, but ultimately, if you're not functioning in the here and now moment of the individual,
you know, and if we bring back what we talked about in the last one about the connect, integrate, and expand, what I'm hearing you, so, you know, we get this piece of information, what do we connect it to? Right? So,
which works well with a fragmented mind.
Well, I'll connect it to here.
To fragment it further.
But then how do we integrate?
And
the integration happens alone in, you know, and stillness and not being distracted, and yet, you know, I hear about people, like especially children and young adults, never being alone. at all.
Or never being bored.
Or never being bored, right? They're always doing something, so they never develop internally, so they never integrate things.
Totally.
And then, so they never get to expand, so they're just existing in this moment in a fragmented state. And we wonder why these things are happening. And, you know, and this is something I'm seeing more and more in my work, is people with no sense of self, not just not knowing who they are at that deeper spiritual level, actually having no sense of self. They don't know where they end and another person begins, right? They don't know what they actually like. They can't make a choice. They're not connected to anything. And it brings me to the metaphor that sometimes I use with people, is like you go to some education forum, training course, and it's like they give you a brick of information. And some kids or some adults see that brick and go, well, I don't know where that fits, and throw it out the window on the way home. Some take it home and they put it in a brick pile, so they'll have this pile of bricks. And a few know that brick is part of their house, and you know, they've built a house by the end of school or the end of this working thing. But they didn't have a plan. Like none are given a plan, and none are given a foundation. And yet this energy pattern of humanity gives you a plan, gives you a foundation. So then all that information can be built, or you know that I don't need to know the integrative algebra to work out that, because that's not part of my life. I don't need to learn that. And so, you know, I feel like we get loaded with too much information that isn't connected, integrated to anything. But we get lost in it.
And I was a prime time example when I first came here. You know, the amount of, I've got degrees in psychology, I'd run a podcast, I'd listen to podcasts, I've read all the books, all this.
You had far more information than I ever had.
And the first part, the first year of being here was just kicking it all off the deck and just being empty.
Yes. I remember
being
that.
empty.
So I really think, you know, we need to have, as part of our living, loving, learning, for every human being, these collective circular collaborations where people can come together and actually be and do at the same time. And wouldn't it be awesome if workplaces were like this, schools were like this? Because we spend nearly all of our time in a collective.
Indeed.